3 words. Just 3 short words, printed on telegraph paper, destroyed the reputation of one of America's most influential families faster than any stock market crash. This happened in June 1910. New York journalists, accustomed to boring reports about charity balls, suddenly received a sensation that took the breath away from stuffy high society. The telegram was sent by a man officially considered insane. It was received by a man whom everyone regarded as the embodiment of success, talent, and sanity. The text read, "Who's loony now?" This phrase instantly became a catchphrase. It was whispered in the corridors of the Metropolitan Opera, printed on front pages, turned into a malicious joke that would outlive its author by 100 years. But behind this sarcasm hid a tragedy of Shakespearean scale. The sender was John Armstrong Challoner, heir to the great Astor dynasty, escapee from a psychiatric clinic, a man whom his own brothers and sisters locked in a cage to get to his millions. The recipient was his own brother, Robert Chandler, who had just made the stupidest financial mistake in the history of the Gilded Age. Robert, known in society circles as Sheriff Bob, signed a marriage contract with opera diva Lina Cavalieri, a woman whose beauty was called hypnotic and grip deadly. A week after the wedding, she took almost all his assets from him and annulled the marriage. The amount of losses was colossal, and the humiliation public. And it was at that very moment, from the wilds of Virginia State, from his voluntary exile, the rejected brother John delivered his blow. His question, "Who's loony now?" was not just mockery. It was a verdict on the entire system of values in which money meant more than blood ties. To understand the full depth of this hatred, we need to rewind the tape back, not to the moment of the telegram, but to the origins of the madness. John Armstrong's story is not just a family quarrel. It is a courtroom thriller where the stakes were a man's freedom and a fortune that, converted to modern money, amounted to about $150 million. Imagine the level of this wealth. John was the great-grandson of John Jacob Astor, the man who once owned half of Manhattan. When John was born, his fate seemed predetermined. Private schools, a prestigious university, marriage to his equal, capital management, and an honorary place on the board of directors of some bank. He was part of the elite that believed the laws of physics and economics did not apply to them. But John made an unforgivable mistake. He dared to be different. He became fascinated by mysticism. He spoke of the X-faculty, the superhuman power of the mind. He held seances. For us today, this sounds like harmless eccentricity, common to many creative people. But for his family at the end of the 19th century, it became a convenient pretext. A pretext to declare him incompetent. On March 13, 1897, a carriage pulled up to his house. Out of it came not doctors, but 2 policemen and his own brothers. They had a warrant in hand. Without trial, without investigation, without the possibility to hire a lawyer, John was subdued and taken to Bloomingdale, the most expensive and most terrifying prison for the rich, cynically called an asylum. His cell was luxurious. He was served 3-course lunches on porcelain, but there were bars on the windows, and the door was locked from the outside. The Astor Chandler family solved the problem simply. No person, no scandal. They miscalculated in only one thing. They underestimated the intellect and fury of the one they locked up. For 4 years, John spent in isolation, planning not just an escape, but a grand legal revenge. When he escaped, and he did escape, simply by walking away during a stroll and outsmarting the guards, he created a unique legal precedent. By crossing the state border, he found himself in a paradoxical situation. The court of the state of Virginia recognized him as a fully sane person, capable of managing his millions. But as soon as he crossed the border of the state of New York, he again became officially insane, subject to immediate arrest. He became a legal centaur, a man who was simultaneously a madman and a genius, a prisoner and a free citizen, depending on which side of the geographical map he stood. This story frightens with its relevance. We look at it through the prism of a century, but see the same mechanisms that work today. Recall the recent high-profile trials of pop stars whose lives were controlled by guardians. The mechanism is the same. If you have too much money and behave strangely, there will always be relatives ready to take care of you for control over your account. But before we see John's fall and triumph, we need to understand where this cursed money came from. We need to go back to the beginning, to the foundation on which this golden cage stood. Because the tragedy of the heirs is always rooted in the sins of the founders. Great fortunes are never made in white gloves. The Astor Empire was built on the blood of animals and the sweat of the poor, and every dollar that came to John bore the imprint of this harsh, inhumane efficiency. We are traveling back in time to see how the capital was created that would drive some mad and destroy others. Welcome to a world where a brother sells his brother for a trust fund. All this drama with asylums, telegrams, and multi-million-dollar lawsuits became possible thanks to one single man. His name was Johann Jakob Astor. When he stepped off the ship in the port of Baltimore in March 1784, he had only a few coins in his pocket and 7 flutes in his luggage that he hoped to sell. He was the son of a butcher from a tiny German town, and no one, looking at this skinny 20-year-old guy, could have guessed that the future owner of New York stood before them. Johann, who quickly changed his name to the more American John Jacob, was no dreamer. He was a predator. He instantly realized that musical instruments would not bring wealth. The gold of that time was fur, beaver pelts. Europe was going crazy for fur hats, and Astor rushed into the forests. This was not business in the modern sense, with offices and secretaries. This was war. Astor personally traveled deep into the continent, negotiated with Indians, bought pelts for next to nothing, for beads, knives, and cheap alcohol, and resold them in London with 1,000% markup. He shunned nothing. When the fur market became too crowded, his ships began carrying opium to China and brought back tea and silk. Yes, the foundation of one of America's most respectable families was steeped in getting native peoples drunk and drug trafficking. But history forgives winners, and Astor always won. By 1830, he had become the first multimillionaire in the history of the United States. But unlike his future great-grandsons, he hated spending money. He collected it. His stinginess became legendary. He could haggle for hours over the price of a ferry ticket or the quality of fabric for his frock coat. He lived not to enjoy life, but to make the number in his ledger grow. Astor's main genius move was exiting risky trade and pivoting to real estate. He looked at the muddy farms and swamps north of the then city of New York and saw the future there. While others laughed, buying bank stocks, Astor snapped up land, by the acre, by the block. His strategy was simple and ruthless. Buy land, but build nothing on it. Wait. When the city expanded and prices soared to the skies, he leased plots to developers. Astor's rule stated, never sell land, only lease. He became the landlord of an entire island. Those very streets where the Empire State Building and Times Square skyscrapers would later rise were once just mud
belonging to old John Jacob. By the end of his life, he had turned into a living mummy. His digestion failed, and, according to rumors, he was fed breast milk from a wet nurse like an infant. But his mind remained sharp as a razor when it came to money. At the moment of his death in 1848, his fortune was estimated at $20 million. So you understand the scale. It was 1/7 of the entire gross national product of the USA at that time. Converted to modern money, that's more than $100 billion.
He was richer than Bill Gates or Jeff Bezos at the zenith of their fame, if counting by share of the country's economy. But along with the money, he left a terrible legacy. He created a trust structure designed to preserve the capital at any cost. The money was not to be divided. It was to be concentrated. This created an atmosphere of paranoia and competition within the family. Every heir knew either he would multiply the wealth or he would be erased from history. John Jacob Astor died, confident that he had built an eternal empire. He could not imagine that just 3 generations later, his descendants, satiated and pampered, would begin devouring each other. He did not build palaces. He lived in a modest brick house. But he left his children the resources to build real castles. And that was exactly the beginning of the end. When the old butcher passed away, a generation took the stage that had never known the smell of raw hides and blood. They knew only the scent of French perfumes and the crunch of starched napkins. The era began that Mark Twain would call the Gilded Age. Outwardly, a thin layer of gold inside, cheap metal. And it was in this world that our hero, John Armstrong, was destined to be born, to become the first victim of his own inheritance. The death of old John Jacob Astor in 1848 resembled the breaching of a dam. Those $20 million which he had accumulated with maniacal stinginess, saving on buttons and candles, flooded into the hands of people who had never in their lives held anything heavier than a baccarat crystal glass. The era arrived that Mark Twain dubbed with poisonous accuracy the Gilded Age. Not golden, note, but precisely gilded. The thinnest layer of gold leaf designed to conceal the coarse, rusty steel on which industrial America stood. If the dynasty's founder was the archetype of a stern Protestant for whom labor was prayer, then his great-grandsons became America's first aristocrats. They did not work. That word was considered vulgar in their circle. They managed assets, or more precisely, they spent. It was during this period that the Astor name ceased to be associated with fur and real estate and became a synonym for unimaginable, almost indecent luxury. To understand the world in which our hero, John Armstrong Chandler, grew up, one must imagine New York of the 1870s and 1880s. It was a world without income tax. Every dollar earned from renting slums where Irish immigrants died of tuberculosis went straight into the pockets of Fifth Avenue owners. The family's fortune grew on its own, like a cancerous tumor devouring the city. The founder's son, William Backhouse Astor, doubled his father's inheritance, but the true scale of madness began with the grandsons and great-grandsons. John Armstrong was born in 1862. His mother was Margaret Astor Ward, granddaughter of that very old butcher. But fate played a cruel joke on John and his brothers, which determined their further tragedy. They became known as the Astor Orphans. Their mother died of pneumonia when John was only 13 years old. Their father, Congressman John Winthrop Chandler, followed her to the grave 2 years later. Imagine this picture. 7 children, the eldest of whom had barely turned 15, left alone in the huge, gloomy Rokeby estate in the Hudson Valley. They had no parents, but they had trust funds guaranteeing each an income equivalent to millions of dollars a year today. Their upbringing was handled not by loving parents, but by an army of hired servants, lawyers, and managers who bowed to them because these children were their employers. It was in Rokeby, in this isolated playground for millionaires, that the brothers' characters began to form. They grew up wild, eccentric, and completely detached from reality. While their cousins in New York learned how to properly hold an oyster fork and memorized the genealogical trees of European monarchs, the Chandler brothers staged nightly tournaments in the estate, galloped horses through the living rooms, and lived by the laws of Lord of the Flies, only in the setting of Victorian luxury. But as soon as John reached adulthood, he was forced to face the world of high society, ruled by his cousin grandmother, the legendary Mrs. Caroline Astor. This woman was not just a social lioness. She was the dictator of New York. It was she who invented the concept of the 400. Her ballroom accommodated exactly 400 people. That's how many, in her opinion, made up all decent American society. If you weren't on this list, you didn't exist. Life in this circle was an exhausting arms race. Mansions on Fifth Avenue were built not for comfort, but for intimidation. The house of Cornelius Vanderbilt II, for example, occupied an entire block and had 130 rooms. Inside reigned a cult of excess. Walls were paneled with the rarest wood brought from Loire castles. Ceilings were painted by artists summoned from Paris, and fireplaces were so large that a whole bull could be roasted in them. One dinner in such a house could cost $10,000, a sum on which an ordinary family could live comfortably for 20 years. The menu consisted of 10 to 12 courses: turtle soup, oysters, pheasants, truffles, foie gras, and all washed down with rivers of champagne. Women wore literally kilograms of diamonds on themselves. A dress from Charles Worth, the chief couturier of that era, cost no less than $1,000 and was worn only 1 or 2 times. But behind this brilliance hid a monstrous emptiness. It was a generation devoid of purpose. The founder had a mission: to survive and get rich. His great-grandsons had no mission. They didn't need to struggle. They had nothing to prove. Boredom became the main disease of the era, and this boredom, multiplied by permissiveness, began to erode their psyche. It was in this atmosphere of a golden cage that John Armstrong Chandler began to seek an escape. He didn't want to be just one of the Astors, a mannequin at a ball. He felt other forces within himself. While his brother Bob, the future sheriff, squandered his fortune in Parisian brothels and painted surrealist pictures, John immersed himself in the study of occultism. He tried to find meaning where his family saw only madness. The contrast between outward prosperity and inner rot was becoming unbearable. On one side, balls where fountains of rose water sprayed in the center of the table, and guests were given gold cigar cases encrusted with precious stones. On the other, cold, empty corridors of Rokeby, where the grown Chandler brothers began to look at each other not as family, but as competitors for control over the shared inheritance. The Astor's money, meant to ensure the family's security for centuries, turned into poison. It poisoned relations between the brothers even before they could understand what was happening. The Gilded Age was approaching its peak, and no one noticed that the foundation had already cracked. John Armstrong, the most sensitive and possibly the smartest of the brothers, was the first to feel this rift. But his attempt to break free from the script written by his dead great-grandfather would lead to his own brothers deciding, better to have a mad relative in a cage than a free one who spends money not by the rules.
We are approaching the moment when the family's social ambitions clash with the heir's personal freedom. The war of new and old money was brutal, but the war within one family would prove far more terrifying. In the next part, we will see how the desire to meet high society standards forced the Astors and Chandlers to sacrifice one of their own, to save face before those very 400, whose opinion they valued more than a brother's life. War is usually associated with the roar of artillery, muddy trenches, and the smell of gunpowder. But in late 19th century New York, a different kind of war was waged. It was silent, smelled of French perfumes and starched linens, and instead of bayonets, it used calling cards and dinner invitations. Yet there were no fewer victims, and the wounds inflicted by icy snubs did not heal for decades. For the Chandler brothers, and especially for John, this battlefield was home. They were born at the top. They didn't need to climb. Their task was to hold the peak, while from below, like a horde of barbarians, the new money advanced. The generalissimo of this war was their own relative, Mrs. Caroline Astor, whom the family and the press called simply Mrs. Astor, without a first name, like a queen. It was this woman, clad in black velvet and laden with diamonds that could cover the external debt of a small European country, who held all of New York in fear. Her weapon was the list, the famous 400 list. The logic was murderously simple and cynical. The ballroom in her Fifth Avenue mansion accommodated exactly 400 people. Therefore, Caroline reasoned, exactly 400 people in New York were worth knowing. If your name wasn't on the list, you were nobody. You were social dust, even if your pockets were bursting with millions earned from railroads or coal. This system created an atmosphere of paranoid fear. People woke up with one thought: will I receive an invitation? Wives of railroad magnates sobbed into their pillows when the Astor's footmen passed by their doors. And at the center of this madness were the Chandler brothers, the Astor orphans, whose elite status was guaranteed by blood, but whose behavior was beginning to raise questions. The social war required colossal resources. Mansions turned into siege engines. This is no metaphor. The house had to scream of wealth so loudly as to drown out whispers about the money's origins. In Newport, Rhode Island, where the elite spent summers, the most expensive architectural arms race in human history began. Families built so-called cottages. In reality, these were marble palaces, aping Versailles or Italian palazzos. Cornelius Vanderbilt's The Breakers had 70 rooms and was adorned with gold and platinum. The marble for Marble House cost $7 million at the time, an insane, incomprehensible sum. And all this for just 6 weeks of summer rest. John Armstrong Chandler watched this parade of vanity with growing disgust. While his brothers, Louis and Bob, reveled in the game, striving to fit in, John began committing unforgivable errors. He stopped playing by the rules. In a world where the chief sin was difference, John allowed himself to be eccentric. Instead of erecting yet another Newport palace and discussing Caroline Astor's Yorkshire Terrier's pedigree with her, he headed to North Carolina. There, in the backwoods, he set out to build an industrial city, Roanoke Rapids. He aimed to harness hydropower for cotton mills, providing jobs for poor white Southerners. For the Astor clan, this was worse than madness. It was class betrayal. An Astor must not work. An Astor must not soil his hands in industry. An Astor must clip coupons and dance quadrilles. John broke the unspoken code. He tried to be useful. But the worst came when the new money threat loomed on the horizon. The Vanderbilts, whom Mrs. Astor had scorned for years as parvenus, finally breached the defenses.
Alva Vanderbilt threw a costume ball of such luxury that even the Astors couldn't ignore it. Caroline surrendered and paid a courtesy call. Old and new money merged in an ecstasy of consumption. And here John's figure became truly dangerous for his brothers. Louis and Bob understood. To survive in this new, united world of predators, they needed to be impeccable. Their name was their main asset, and a brother who spends millions on utopian projects, talks to spirits, and refuses to wear the proper tailcoat. This was a liability. This was vulnerability. In the drawing rooms, whispers began. "Did you hear what John said yesterday? Does he really believe he can change eye color?" These whispers were scarier than lawsuits. In the Gilded Age world, the label of madman stuck forever. If society decided that the Chandler branch had tainted blood, doors would close for Louis and Bob too. No one would marry their daughters to brothers of a madman. No one would invite them to boards of directors. Louis Stuyvesant Chandler, the most ambitious of the brothers, future politician, understood this first. John had become a threat to their social ascent. He needed to be removed from the scene. Not killed, that would be too crude and criminally punishable. He needed to be hidden, made invisible. The social war turned into cold calculation. On one side of the scales was the brothers' freedom. On the other, the family's position in the 400 list and access to capital. Louis and Bob chose the second. They convinced themselves that they were doing it for his own good. This is the favorite lie of all executioners in family dramas. Thus, under the clink of crystal glasses and the rustle of silk, the verdict was passed. While John was planning the development of his city in North Carolina, in New York, his brothers were already meeting with doctors, ready to sign any papers for the appropriate fee. The glitter of the Gilded Age blinded so much that no one noticed how, in the shadow of marble columns, a kidnapping was being prepared. But before we see the trap snap shut, we need to understand one more detail of this era. A detail that finally corrupted Robert Chandler's soul and made him the perfect accomplice in this crime. It's about love. More precisely, about what replaced love in their circle. Deals, titles, and women who cost more than yachts. If the social war in New York was the battlefield, then marriages in the Gilded Age became its main trading floor. By the end of the 19th century, American capital faced an unexpected problem. There was too much money and too little respect. American millionaires, these kings of pork, coal, and railroads, could buy everything except one thing: history. In Europe, the situation was the mirror opposite. The old aristocracy sat in crumbling castles with leaking roofs, having a lineage 1,000 years long, but not having money even for coal for the fireplace. Thus was born the most cynical and large-scale deal in the history of transatlantic relations: the exchange of dollars for titles. Girls from wealthy American families began to be called dollar princesses. They were packaged like expensive goods and sent across the ocean for the season in London or Paris to exchange their dowries for a coat of arms, a title, and the right to call themselves your ladyship. This was no romance. This was cold, calculated commerce. In the accounting books of these families, wedding expenses were listed under the same category as real estate investments. The most vivid and tragic example, which set the tone for the entire era, was the wedding of Consuelo Vanderbilt, neighbor and rival of the Astors. Her mother, Alva, literally forced her daughter to marry the Duke of Marlborough. What was the price? $2.5 million in dowry, transferred to the Duke immediately after the ceremony. In today's money, that's about $80 million. The Duke got the money to renovate his Blenheim palace. Alva got satisfaction of her ambitions, and Consuelo got a husband who didn't love her, and a life in a golden cage. The Chandler brothers, being part of this circle, grew up understanding that marriage was not a union of hearts, but a merger of assets. And if John Armstrong, our mad hero, sought spiritual connection and mystical kinship in women, then his normal brother Robert, the very Sheriff Bob, took the era's lessons too literally. He decided to buy not a title, but a living legend. His chosen one was Lina Cavalieri, an opera singer whose name resounded around the world. She was called the most beautiful woman on earth. Her face was printed on postcards, soap, and candy boxes. She was Marilyn Monroe and Madonna of her time in one person. But behind the angelic appearance hid the iron calculation of a woman who grew up in Roman slums and clawed her way to the top with her elbows and voice. Robert Chandler, by that time already a bored artist and playboy, was blinded. He saw in Lina a trophy that could be placed on the mantelpiece next to the Astor family silver. He, like many men in his circle, believed that money could buy loyalty. This was a fatal mistake that cost him more than any ducal title. The deal was formalized in Paris, in an atmosphere of decadence and permissiveness. Lina Cavalieri, fully understanding whom she was dealing with, laid down conditions. She didn't want just a ring. She wanted guarantees. Before the wedding, Robert signed a marriage contract that the family lawyers would later call the document of a madman. Consider the terms of this deal. Robert transferred to Lina rights to manage a significant portion of his real estate and income from the trust fund. He effectively handed her the key to the safe in exchange for the right to appear with her in public. This was an act of colossal vanity. The normal brother, who along with Lewis had committed John to an insane asylum for strange behavior, himself committed an act bordering on idiocy. The description of their wedding resembled a theatrical production where the sets were more important than the actors. Huge halls drowning in orchids delivered by special trains. Guests whose names flashed in society columns whispered behind the groom's back, discussing exactly how much this love cost. The bride, in a dress embroidered with real pearls, looked like a victor. The groom, flushed from champagne and pride, looked like a man who had just bought the Titanic an hour before colliding with the iceberg. The cynicism of the situation lay in the fact that everyone around understood this wouldn't last long. Lina Cavalieri collected husbands and admirers just as the Astors collected houses. For her, Robert was just another step, an American wallet with a loud name. For Robert, she was a way to prove his significance, to thumb his nose at society, to show that he possessed the most beautiful woman in the world. While John Armstrong, deprived of rights and freedom, sat in his exile studying legal books and planning revenge, his brother voluntarily put shackles on himself. Only these shackles were made of gold and sealed with a notary's signature. This marriage became the culmination of the rot that was eating the family from within. The idea that money could buy happiness, security, or love became the Astors' religion. They forgot the founders' precepts, who knew the value of every cent. They turned into those very clients whom old John Jacob would fleece like sheep. A week after the honeymoon, the fairy tale ended. Lina, having gained control over the assets, lost all interest in her husband. Robert was left alone in an empty hotel room with an empty account and a shattered reputation. It was precisely this moment of absolute collapse of the sane brother that would become the signal for the mad John. History had prepared the stage for that very telegram. But first,
We need to peer inside those walls where this fear grew. We need to enter the house that was not a fortress, but a prison, even before bars appeared on the windows. To understand why John Armstrong Chandler began hearing voices and seeing what others did not, we must stop looking at bank accounts and gaze at the walls in which he grew up. We are accustomed to thinking that life in a mansion is a fairy tale.
A Disney castle where birds sing and footmen serve. But the reality of the Rokeby estate in the Hudson Valley was closer to the Gothic novels of Edgar Allan Poe than to a fairy tale. Rokeby was not just a building of brick and limestone. It was a 43-room monster that breathed, creaked, and slowly digested its inhabitants. Located on the banks of the Hudson, in an area that old Dutch settlers considered mystical and full of ghosts, the house was always shrouded in dampness and fog. Unlike the gleaming new Vanderbilt palaces in Newport, Rokeby was old. It was dark. It was overflowing with the things of the dead. The dynasty's founders threw nothing away. Rooms were crammed with heavy Victorian mahogany furniture that absorbed the light from gas jets, leaving corners in eternal twilight. Walls were hung with portraits of ancestors whose eyes followed every step of the Astor orphans. Imagine a childhood where you play hide and seek not among bright toys, but among marble busts of great-grandfathers who look at you with silent reproach. We earned millions, and what have you done? The architecture of this house was designed to suppress. High ceilings created echoes, turning any child's laughter into an ominous hum. Huge fireplaces, devouring cords of wood, could not warm the drafts wandering through the corridors. In winter, water froze in the pitchers in the bedrooms. It was a cold, physically uncomfortable world, wrapped in velvet and brocade. But even more terrifying was the social architecture of the house. Life in Rokeby was divided into two parallel worlds that were never supposed to intersect emotionally, but constantly collided physically. The world of the masters and the world of the servants. Servants in such houses were an invisible army. Their schedule resembled a military code. A housemaid's day began at 5 a.m. to have time to clean the ash from all the fireplaces while the masters slept. It was grueling, back-breaking labor, carrying coal to the upper floors, hauling buckets of hot water, polishing silver until fingers bled, and all this in absolute silence. Servants were forbidden to speak in the presence of the masters unless addressed. They had to blend into the wallpaper. For little John and his brothers, these people were the only adults who were constantly around. But these adults were functions. The butler, this was hands serving a tray. The nanny, this was a voice ordering to sleep. There was no place for warmth here. Any attachment between heir and servant was suppressed as a breach of subordination. This formed a monstrous sense of loneliness. You are surrounded by dozens of people, but you are absolutely alone. In this isolation, John began seeking company where there was none. He spent hours in the huge Rokeby library, crammed with books that no one read. He wandered the park, where old oaks cast shadows resembling monsters. It was precisely here, in the silence and cold of Rokeby, that his inclination toward mysticism was born. If the living people around you behave like mannequins, you start talking to spirits. The house dictated its own rules of behavior. Lunch, this was not just eating food, this was a ritual. You couldn't sit down at the table whenever you wanted. You had to dress for dinner, even if there were only two of you, and you were brothers. The silver had to lie in strict order, the menu in French, a footman behind your back, watching whether your glass was empty. This absurd theatricality of everyday life drove one mad. It created the sensation that life was an endless play where you were obliged to play the role of an Astor, even if you wanted simply to be human. The servants knew more about John's eccentricities than his brothers did. They saw him talking to himself in the garden. They found his notebooks with automatic writing. But in the world of servants, the law of silence operated. What happens in the house stays in the house. Until the time came. Later, when the trial began, it was precisely the servants' testimonies that became the weapon which the lawyers used against John. Those very people who tied his shoelaces and served him tea would tell the jury about his mad gaze and strange rituals. Rokeby became an incubator for tragedy. For Louis and Bob, this house was simply an asset, a base from which they conducted raids on New York. For John, it became a cage. He felt the vibrations of this place, its heavy karma. He tried to rebuild his life, to leave, to create something of his own in North Carolina, but the shadow of Rokeby pursued him. The irony of fate lay in the fact that when John was locked up in Bloomingdale, his conditions changed little. The same luxurious room, the same servants, the same isolation, the same cold regime. The psychiatric asylum for millionaires was merely a grotesque reflection of their family nest. John Armstrong simply exchanged one golden cage for another. Only now the door had a lock, the key to which was held by his brother. But while John struggled with ghosts in his head, the real rot was eating away at the souls of those who considered themselves normal. Behind the facade of propriety, in bedrooms and studies, things happened that were far more insane than seances. The time has come to look under the carpet of this perfect family and see the dirt they so carefully hid. While John Armstrong sat in his cell in Bloomingdale, studying legal codes and practicing telepathy, the world that declared him mad was slowly going truly insane. The irony of fate was that the diagnosis of paranoia was given to the most sober and physically healthy member of the family. The other, normal heirs, meanwhile, plunged into an abyss of vices that medical directories of the time delicately called nervous exhaustion, but which were actually a mixture of alcoholism, drug addiction, and sexual promiscuity. Let's look at Robert Sheriff Bob Chandler, the very brother who signed the papers for John's involuntary commitment. Society considered him an eccentric artist, the life of the party. But behind the closed doors of his studio on 19th Street, a hell was unfolding that could scare even seasoned visitors to Parisian dens. Robert didn't just drink. He destroyed himself with a methodicalness worthy of a better application. His breakfast often consisted of a glass of brandy. His nights passed in an opium haze. At that time, opium and morphine were not considered criminal. They were sold in pharmacies as remedies for cough or insomnia. New York's elite was hooked, just as tightly as Chinese dock workers. Only their syringes were silver, and doses were measured by personal physicians. Robert's art was a mirror of his disintegrating psyche. He painted eerie, phantasmagoric frescoes, giraffes devouring trees, grotesque fish entwined in orgies, blood-red jungles. This was not just art. It was the scream of a consciousness poisoned by absinthe and syphilis. Yes, that very disease of kings and poets was the scourge of the aristocracy. It was treated with mercury, which only accelerated the madness. Symptoms were concealed with powder and veils, and fits of rage were chalked up to hot temper. Louis Stuyvesant Chandler, the second brother and chief architect of John's confinement, suffered from a different affliction. His disease was power and hypocrisy. He built a political career, aimed for governor, shook voters' hands, and preached morality. But it was he, this pillar of society, who coldly orchestrated the scheme to keep his brother imprisoned for control over the trust. Louis's rot was invisible. It corroded not the liver, but the conscience. He hired New York's best lawyers to prove in court that John's belief in changing eye color warranted lifelong incarceration, while Robert's binges were merely endearing pranks of a wealthy heir. Double standards formed the foundation of their existence. If a Bowery poor man got drunk and rowdy, he was sent to prison or a workhouse. If an Astor or Chandler did it, the police saluted and escorted him to his carriage. The Gilded Age forgave the rich everything except losing money, and the money was melting away. The lifestyle the heirs led demanded astronomical expenditures. Maintaining mistresses, gambling debts, bribes to journalists to suppress scandalous details of nighttime escapades, all this drained the capital amassed by their grandfather. An atmosphere of nervous breakdown began to prevail in the family. The Chandler sisters, who also took part in the conspiracy of silence, suffered depressions and failed marriages. Their lives became an endless succession of visits to psychoanalysts, then just coming into fashion, and trips to European spas to restore their nerves. At the same time in Bloomingdale, the mad John led a Spartan life. He didn't drink, he exercised, he read classical literature, he wrote philosophical treatises. Against his normal relatives, who by 40 looked like wrecks, he appeared a paragon of health. His mind, liberated from the need to join social races and feign at balls, sharpened like a scalpel. The rot behind the facade grew obvious to anyone with eyes. Scandals began leaking into the press. Robert's divorce from Lena Cavalieri was merely the first crack in the dam. Journalists, smelling blood, dug deeper. They posed uncomfortable questions. Why was one Astor heir locked in an asylum when he posed no danger to society? Why did his guardians, his own brothers, spend his money on their political campaigns and parties? Society began to realize that true madness reigned not in Ward No. 6 of the Bloomingdale Clinic, but in the mansions on Fifth Avenue. John Armstrong became the mirror into which the family was afraid to look. He was their conscience, locked in a cage. And the more the normal Chandlers rotted, the clearer it became that John must be released to deliver the final blow to them. But before justice triumphs, a tragedy must occur. The point of no return, which will show that money cannot protect from death and fate. Fate was preparing a lesson for the Astor family that they would remember forever. The rot had eaten through the foundation, and now the entire building was ready to collapse. In any great tragedy, there is a moment when fate stops whispering and starts screaming. For the Astor dynasty and their poor relatives, the Chandlers, this scream sounded on the night of April 14th to 15th, 1912. It was the night when the North Atlantic proved that icy water at -2 degrees Celsius is absolutely indifferent to the size of a bank account, the purity of lineage, and the number of zeros in a trust fund. The event that divided the family's history into before and after was the sinking of the Titanic. On board this floating palace was the clan leader, our hero's cousin, John Jacob Astor IV. The man called the Master of New York. His fortune was estimated at $87 million. In modern money, that's more than $2.5 billion. He was a symbol of immutability. If anyone could buy life from God himself, it was he. But when the giant propeller of the ship rose above the black water, John Jacob Astor IV stood on the deck, smoking a cigarette. He seated his pregnant young wife in a lifeboat, asked the officer if he could accompany her since she was in a delicate condition, received a refusal, and calmly stepped aside. He died as befitted an old-school gentleman, without hysteria, in a tuxedo, crushed by a falling smokestack. This death became a colossal shock for all of America, but for the Chandler family, it was a catastrophe.
The king was dead. The empire was left without a head. The body of the world's richest man was fished out a few days later. He was identified only by the initials on his shirt collar and gold watch with diamonds. It was a terrible, grotesque metaphor. The ocean returned the gold, but took the life. At the same time, our exile, John Armstrong Chandler, was at his estate, Merry Mills, in Virginia. He was alive. He was healthy.
The very man whom the family had declared incompetent and dangerous to himself was peacefully sleeping in his bed, while the most rational and successful representative of the lineage froze in the ocean. The death of Cousin Jack on the Titanic became that point of no return, after which the balance of power in the family collapsed. Fear vanished. The aura of untouchability vanished. Brothers Louis and Bob, who for years had hidden behind the back of the powerful cousin, suddenly felt naked. Their protection disappeared. And John, on the contrary, went on the decisive offensive. It was precisely during this period that the culmination of his personal struggle occurred. John did the incredible. He turned his life into a public trial of the family. He wrote a book, not just memoirs, but a legally certified manifesto titled 4 Years Behind the Bars. In it, with the precision of a court stenographer, with dates, names, and amounts, he laid out the story of his kidnapping. The book produced the effect of an exploding bomb. Society, which yesterday was laughing at the lunatic, suddenly recoiled in horror. Readers saw not the ravings of a madman, but the cold logic of a conspiracy victim. John publicly accused his brothers of greed. He put their financial machinations on public display. He tore the velvet curtain from the facade of the Astor family and showed everyone the dirty brickwork. In Virginia, another event occurred that could have destroyed John, but instead tempered his legend. A tragedy happened in his home. He accidentally killed a man. During a domestic quarrel, defending a woman from her drunken husband, the gun in John's hand fired. The man was dead. It seemed like here it was, proof of his madness and danger. Louis and Bob in New York were already rubbing their hands, preparing to finally put their brother away in prison or a strict regime asylum. But a miracle happened, possible only in America of that time. The jury of the state of Virginia, consisting of simple farmers and workers, acquitted John. They recognized it as an accident and self-defense. The local residents adore their mad millionaire. For them, he is a philanthropist who builds schools, provides jobs, and doesn't put on airs. They see in him a man of honor, unlike his polished New York relatives. This was a complete rout for Louis and Bob. Their mad brother not only survived in exile, not only outlived the death of the clan leader, but also came out unscathed in a murder case, preserving the love of the people. Meanwhile, in New York, in the mansions where merriment had once reigned, fear settled in. After the Titanic, the era of unrestrained revelry ended. Hangover set in. Income tax was introduced. World War I began. The world created for balls and yachts began to crack at the seams. Louis Stuyvesant Chandler, once a brilliant politician, began to lose influence. The scandal with his brother cost him his career. Voters didn't want to vote for a man who locked his own brother in a cage for money. Robert Sheriff Bob finally succumbed to alcoholism, turning into a parody of himself. His paintings became ever darker, his debts ever larger. The point of no return had been passed. John Armstrong Chandler, prisoner of Bloomingdale, won the main battle of his life. He proved that normality is a relative concept. In a world where normal people send ships into icebergs for speed records and sell daughters for titles, being a mad recluse in Virginia turned out to be the most reasonable survival strategy. Now, with enemies morally defeated and the old world lying in ruins at the bottom of the Atlantic, all that remained was to watch the physical disintegration of the empire. The money for which this war was started began to disappear like sand through fingers. The time of great downfall was coming, when palaces would go under the hammer at the price of construction debris. The end of this story does not sound like a pistol shot or the clink of a broken glass. It sounds like the dull, monotonous thud of a sledgehammer against a marble wall. The era of the Gilded Age was dying amid the roar of demolition. Those very palaces, built to last centuries, like Egyptian pyramids for a millennium, began to vanish from the face of the earth less than 40 years after construction. The irony of fate, which our hero John Armstrong loved so much, manifested here in full. The Astor Empire was not destroyed by scandals or the madness of heirs. It was destroyed by boring accounting and the 16th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, introduced in 1913. It allowed the federal government to levy income tax. For the Astors, whose business model was built on the principle of take everything and give nothing back, this became a death sentence. Then came the great crash of 1929. Stock reports, once read like victory dispatches, turned into obituaries. Assets that seemed immutable devalued in mere days. And here the terrible truth came to light. Maintaining a palace on Fifth Avenue cost more than running a small factory. But the palace produced nothing except dust and vanity. The great sell-off began. It was a heart-wrenching spectacle. Imagine auction halls crammed with items that only yesterday were symbols of their owner's divine status. Tapestries woven by monks in the 16th century went under the hammer at the price of hallway rugs. Silver services for 100 people, from which presidents and kings had eaten, were sold by weight, like scrap non-ferrous metal. The mansion of Mrs. Astor herself, that very epicenter of social life, where the fates of debutantes were decided, was demolished ruthlessly and quickly. In its place, they built the Emmanuel Synagogue, where quadrilles had once been danced and people excluded from the elect lists. Now prayers were offered to the God of humility. This was the final victory of the new world over the old. And what about our heroes? How did the mathematics of the curse strike the Chandler brothers? Robert, Sheriff Bob Chandler, the one who laughed the loudest and lived the brightest, went first. His finale was tragic and predictable. By 1930, not a trace remained of his beauty and charisma. Alcohol and the consequences of his wild youth destroyed his body. He died at the age of 58 from kidney failure and cirrhosis. The man who dreamed of buying the love of the world's most beautiful woman died in solitude, surrounded by his surrealist paintings that frightened the nurses. His once vast fortune was depleted by divorce proceedings and senseless spending. He left behind not an empire, but legends of parties that no one remembered anymore. Louis Stuyvesant Chandler, the sane politician and organizer of John's confinement, outlived his brother, but his life turned into quiet fading. His political career collapsed. His reputation was tarnished. He lived long enough to see his family's name stop evoking awe and start eliciting only nostalgic smiles. He became a living museum exhibit, a man from the previous century who wore old-fashioned suits and grumbled at the new order. And John Armstrong? The lunatic from Virginia? He outlived his main enemy, Brother Bob, by 5 years. And those years were his personal triumph. While in New York, the heirs were jumping out of skyscraper windows, having lost their fortunes, John calmly lived in his estate, Merry Mills. He didn't play the stock market. He didn't build palaces. He lived modestly, by millionaire standards, spending money on supporting local schools and writers. His madness, if it existed at all, proved to be the most reliable form of financial strategy. Paranoia made him cautious. The absence of social ambitions saved his wallet from ruin. When the Great Depression engulfed the country, John was one of the few Astors who had solid ground under his feet. He died in 1935 from cancer, sitting in his chair, a free man who never allowed the system to break him. But the saddest sight was the family nest, Rokeby. The house that served as the stage for this family drama was not demolished, but it was slowly dying. There was no more money to heat the 43 rooms. The roof began to leak. The park overgrew with weeds. Descendants who remained living in the house could no longer hire an army of servants. They themselves washed dishes in that very kitchen where chefs once prepared truffles. Rokeby turned into a monument to decline. Huge portraits of ancestors in gilded frames now hung in rooms where plaster was peeling from the walls. It resembled the sets of a horror movie. Descendants of America's greatest dynasty, living in the ruins of their own grandeur, warming themselves by the only working fireplace wrapped in old blankets. Thus ended this battle, not with an explosion, but with the quiet creak of rotten floorboards. The Astor's money returned to where it came from, dissolved into the economy, passed into the hands of new, hungrier, and more cynical predators. But the story of John Armstrong and his brothers left behind something more important than dollars. It left a warning. They thought they owned things, but in reality, things owned them. They thought they controlled fate, but fate was simply waiting for the music to end. And now, when the dust from the demolition of mansions has settled, all that remains for us is to walk the traces of this vanished civilization and see what really remained of the people who considered themselves gods of New York. If you today get in a car in Manhattan and drive 2 hours north along the Hudson, you can see the finale of this story with your own eyes. Turn off the highway in the town of Berrytown. Drive past the impeccably manicured lawns of 21st century nouveau riche, and look for old, rusty gates that seem not to have been oiled since Queen Victoria's reign. Welcome to Rokeby today. Unlike the Vanderbilt palaces in Newport, which turned into sterile museums with audio guides and souvenir shops, Rokeby remained alive. But this life more resembles the sets of a Tim Burton film. Descendants of the Chandler and Astor families still live here, but instead of tailcoats and diamond tiaras, they wear faded jeans and wool sweaters eaten by moths. This place became a legend among modern hipsters and the New York bohemia. The 43 rooms of the mansion are crammed with things accumulated over 200 years. Here you can find a first edition of Dickens lying under the leg of a wobbly table, or a 19th century couture dress casually thrown over the back of an old sofa. Descendants of the great dynasty live here on a commune principle. They are artists, poets, writers, and wanderers. The irony that our hero, John Armstrong, loved so much reached its apogee here. Remember why he was committed to the asylum? For fascination with mysticism, art, and refusal to follow the family's rigid corporate rules. Look at Rokeby now. The spirit of the sane politician brother Lewis and the greedy cousin Jack has completely dissipated from here. The spirit of mad John triumphed. The house turned into a refuge for eccentrics, exactly the kind he dreamed of. Madness became the norm, and the pursuit of money, bad form. Alexandra Aldrich, great-great-granddaughter of those very Astors, published memoirs a few years ago where she described her childhood in this house. She recounted how in winter they walked around the house in down jackets because it was impossible to heat these huge halls, while paintings worth millions hung on the walls that no one could sell due to the complicated conditions of the family trust. They were rich poor, hostages of the family name, owning history but lacking cash for roof repairs. And what remained of the money itself? Of those $150 million over which the brothers betrayed each other? They dissolved. The Astors as a financial power ceased to exist. Their name remained only on maps: Astor Place, Astoria District, Waldorf Astoria Hotel. But the dynasty itself, like a shark of capitalism, went extinct. The Vincent Astor Foundation of the last great patriarch was sold off and donated to charity. The money collected from fur trade and slum rentals now funds public libraries and parks. Perhaps this is the karmic cleansing that John spoke of. But the most enduring legacy of John Armstrong Chandler was not real estate or the trust fund. It became words. That very phrase from the telegram, "Who's loony now?" outlived both his enemies and their wealth. It entered American culture as a symbol of the outcast's victory over the system. It was quoted in newspapers during the Watergate scandal. It is used in headlines of financial publications when another too-big-to-fail bank declares bankruptcy. This story teaches us that in the long term, the reputation of a madman may prove safer than that of a genius. John Armstrong Chandler spent 4 years in a golden cage to understand one simple truth. The only true freedom is freedom from one's own family's expectations. He died considering himself a victor, and history confirmed his rightness. His brother Robert lost everything for a woman who didn't love him. His brother Lewis lost honor for power he couldn't hold. And John preserved his sanity, though the whole world tried to prove otherwise. Today, looking at the crumbling facade of Rokeby and recalling the glamour and poverty of the Gilded Age, we understand. Big money does not save from tragedies. It simply makes these tragedies more spectacular for the public. The Astors built their empire believing it would stand forever, like Rome. But from their Rome, only beautiful ruins and instructive anecdotes remain. In the end, John Armstrong Chandler, prisoner of his own name, turned out to be the only one who could crack the code of this game. When you stand at the top of the world and everyone around tells you that you've gone mad, just wait. Time will put everything in its place. And when 100 years later, your descendants are painting pictures in your old house and the names of your enemies are forgotten, you can smile and pose your main question to eternity. That very question, which still echoes through the empty corridors of the Rokeby estate. Who's loony now?